Hi everyone. We're going to speak today about the anatomy and physiology of the brain, basically the human nervous system. However, this is the first part of the structural description of the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology of the entire nervous system, and then there will be another section that focuses just only on the cerebral cortex. So let's look at the major structures and the major functions. This is intended as an overview. It is not intended to be, obviously, a comprehensive coverage, but just as an overview. So the nervous system is unique in a way that makes it able to communicate with different parts of the body. The function of the nervous system is to enable you to move around, to basically move your body around. Imagine, for example, that look at the Barney and you look at the suit. Think about the body as that suit. It cannot move, it cannot do anything unless there's someone inside of it to move it. Think about the nervous system as the person that lives in the Barney suit and moves it around. So the nervous system has two major anatomic divisions. The first part, well, anatomic means structural. So the first part is the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And these two are continuous together. You can think of the spinal cord is just like a tail. If you think about the brain as like a body or an animal, and then you can think about the spinal cord as a continuation of that. The whole idea is, let's take it on a different level. If you think about the brain as a hard drive, and you want that hard drive to control the rest of the body, you have to bring in extensions from that hard drive and bring them to different parts of the body. So the spinal cord basically is a big cable that gets a lot of the wiring of the brain together, combined, so that all these extensions and nerves and neurons and all of this, they make tracks, and then they are all assembled into one big cable that goes into the spinal cord and the spinal column, and then out of that you have different branches so that you can send them to your feet, to your torso, your arms, and so on. So the central part of the nervous system is made out of the brain and the spinal cord, and both of these are continuous together. Just while I have the image here, there is a space surrounding the brain and the spinal cord together, and there's fluid in that space. The fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, and that surrounds both the brain and the spinal cord. So they're kind of, both of them are suspended in that fluid, and you don't, for example, feel that you are carrying that 3-pound weight in your head. That is one of the reasons. But we'll speak about cerebrospinal fluid later. So then, out of the brain stem and out of the spinal cord, we get different nerves that are extended out. Inside of out of the brain stem, we have 12 cranial nerves on the right side, 12 on the left side. And these 12 are called cranial nerves because their roots, they originate on the brain stem, and the brain stem that is inside of the skull or the cranium, and we call these nerves the cranial nerves. And then we have the other nerves that come out of the spinal cord are called the spinal nerves. And these two, spinal nerves and cranial nerves, make up the peripheral nervous system. So you have the central here, and like a hard drive, and then the peripheral are the extensions that connect with it, like the mouse, for example, connecting with the hard drive, like the keyboard, and so on. So again, the peripheral nervous system is made up of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The class is anatomy and physiology. So we spoke about the two major anatomic or structural divisions of the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is also divided into two major functional or physiological divisions. It means in terms of function, there are two major branches. One is the autonomic nervous system, and that is, from the name, it is a system that moves, a system that is responsible for functions in your body that you have no control over. For example, a blood pressure. It is regulated throughout the day, and actually, minute by minute, hour by hour. It is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Digestion, heart rate, breathing, all these functions that your body performs spontaneously with no intervention from you, these are autonomic functions. And these are run by a special division of the nervous system that we know functionally as the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system in itself has two other divisions, two minor divisions. One is called the sympathetic nervous system, and one is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic is a system that is concerned with consumption of energy in the body. And when your body needs, for example, you see something threatening, and immediately, like if you are taking a walk in Florida, for example, and you see an alligator, all of a sudden, then you start to have that rush of fear, and we call that the flight, or the fight or flight response. So immediately now your body is going to elevate your temperature. It's going to, maximize burning of energy, and you find yourself having that strength and having that adrenaline rush, and you need to do something. So that is a system that enables the fear response or the fight-flight response. And then the parasympathetic is the system that is concerned with reducing the consumption of energy. The brain doesn't store energy, so that's a big deal. You want to have, to consume energy wisely. So the parasympathetic system is the one that says to you, oh, just, that is a fake alligator, or, it is too far away, or there's a fence. It cannot come to touch you, to threaten. And then you think about it, and then your system starts to calm down, and then you start to stop burning that energy. The somatic nervous system, the second major functional division. So we have the autonomic and then the somatic. The somatic, the name is from soma, means body. It has to do with the intentional or voluntary control of body parts. For example, movement. I can move my hand, I can move my head, my legs, and so on. So the somatic nervous system is concerned with the initiation and control of voluntary movement of different parts of the body. And it has in itself two systems as well. One is the pyramidal system, and one is the extrapyramidal system. These systems basically are concerned with the gross motor and the fine motor regulation of movement in your body. So now, let's look in a little, with a little bit of detail into the different parts of the nervous system. So the central nervous system, back again, central is the brain and the spinal cord. When we take these together, the different parts of the central nervous system, we'll look at smaller parts of it. These include from lower to higher, as you go from below to going up. They include the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is basically, it goes from right beneath the skull, which is this border here. As you could see here, all of this, the upper part here of the brainstem is all inside of the cranium, inside of the skull. Beneath that line, then you have the spinal cord, and it goes all the way down to the bottom of your trunk. So we have the spinal cord, the brain stem, that is the brain stem. All of this is the brain stem, or here. So we have the spinal cord, the brain stem, and the cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain. And then we have a structure called the diencephalon. Encephalon means brain. Di means two. So diencephalon means almost like the brain that has two parts. So this is inside of the brain, deep buried in the center of the brain. And that structure is called the diencephalon. It is made out of two other, smaller structures. And then the cerebrum. The cerebrum. Know the name carefully. Cerebrum. The cerebrum is all of this, the big part that is wrapping around the brainstem and around the diencephalon. Everything, completely everything, with the exception, of course, of the cerebellum. If you take the cerebellum out, and everything that wraps around the brainstem and the diencephalon, that is the cerebrum. So how many structures do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 major structures. The brainstem by itself consists of 3 structures that are the medulla oblongata from the bottom, medulla oblongata, and then the pons here, and then the brain, the midbrain. So make sure to understand the location and the structure of each part, because you will have images like these, and then you will be asked to label, to name these various structures. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major structures, and the brainstem has 3 major structures. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 major structures of the central nervous system. So let's look at the spinal cord. The spinal cord it goes through, there's a difference between the spinal column and the spinal cord. The spinal column is the stack of vertebrae, these vertebrae, one is vertebra, and they are all stacked together, on top of each other. Each vertebra has a canal. So this canal here is called the spinal canal. And the spinal cord goes through the spinal canal. So you could see here, this is a spinal cross-section of the spinal cord, and it goes through the spinal canal. When you have all of these spinal column pieces, all of these vertebrae, and stacked on top of each other, the holes, the spinal canal of each of each vertebra is right on top of the spine, the hole of the other vertebra. So all of these have like a canal, a long canal where the spinal cord is threaded through from the very top to the very bottom. And the spinal, these vertebrae have names, for example. So each segment of them have names. And the spinal cord, even though it is continuous, it is divided based on the names of the vertebrae it passes through. So, for example, this is the spinal column that we understand. We studied this before. The 7 top vertebrae inside of the neck, they are called cervical vertebrae. And then inside of the thorax, we call the 12 vertebrae, we call them thoracic vertebrae. So, and then the lower ones, the lumbar, and then the sacral, and so on. So, the segment of the spinal cord that passes through the cervical vertebrae is called the cervical segment of the spinal cord. And then we have the thoracic segment of the spinal cord. And then we have the lumbar segment. And then we have the sacral segment. And in terms of the coccygeal, it isn't really very significant. So these are the major: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. The functions, as I mentioned, the spinal cord, think of it as just a big cable. Like say you have a huge building that has lights and computers and wiring, electric wiring. Out of the building, everything, every wire that comes out of a classroom or out of anything in the building, all of that is all bundled up into a large cable that is at the beginning of the, outside of the building. So that big cable, inside of it has a wire, a small wire that connects to every class, every bathroom, every location in the building. So the spinal cord is just like that. You just bundle everything and bring it down and then run it through the body, through the trunk. And out of it, you get branches to send to different parts of the body. So you can move it, you can get sensation and so on. So that is, think about it this way. So the functions of the spinal cord are the number one, it receives and it processes sensory information. Sensory means it comes from your senses, touch, for example, hearing, vision, and different parts of the body. For example, sensation to pain, to temperature, anything that comes from the body, it goes then through the spinal cord and then it goes up to the brain to make sense of it. So it receives again and processes sensory information from the skin, from the joints, from the muscles of the limbs, and from the trunk. And also, so all of this information goes up to the brain. And then all the information about movement, the movement originates here. You have a plan, you have a structure. It starts in the very top layer of the brain. And that is then you send a command and it goes down so that you can move your toes, you can, wave, whatever it is. So that means that the spinal cord is also a conduit. It's a pathway that sends motor commands from the cerebral cortex down to the rest of the body. So you can do, make movement possible. And then the spinal cord here, there's a reflex arc. And the spinal cord is able to move things without intentional kind of intervention from the brain. So the spinal cord has some reflexes. It controls movement under certain conditions. For example, when you go to your doctor and you are having an exam and the doctor takes a mallet and hits on your knee, like a tendon beneath your kneecap, and he hits it, what happens to your leg? Your knee jerks, your whole leg jerks forward. And that is called the knee jerk reflex. So when that happens, that is immediately made possible by the spinal cord through a particular arc that is it immediately where the sensory information of the your kneecap being, your knee tendon being hit, then it is going to immediately send the sensation here, and then that is connected with the motor component on the other side, and then that's gonna go down to your muscles of your legs to move your knee up. Also, the withdrawal reflex. Suppose you are sleeping, and then maybe something pricks you, or a candle, for example, or something, starts to burn, and or the sensation to fire or heat or pain, and you are sleeping. Immediately, without your control, you are going to withdraw your arm, and that is not made by the brain making decisions, but by the spinal cord reflex. It's a survival mechanism that makes your body withdraw from pain without your conscious control. So these are the main primary functions of the spinal cord. Now we look at the brain. Before we get into the tissue of the brain itself, the brain, because it's very special, it is wrapped inside of a special kind of wrapping. We call it the meningeal or the meninges or the meningeal layers of the brain. They wrap around the brain in a way as to protect it and to facilitate its function, and also around the spinal cord. So here you see the scalp. This is where your hair grows. Beneath the scalp, there's bone, and that is the bone that's part of your skull. And beneath the bone, you cannot have just brain tissue touching bone. That's dangerous. So beneath the skull, immediately, you have one layer, a special layer of tissue called the dura mater. Mater means mother. You could call it mater also, like when you say my alma mater. So dura mater means the tough mother from Latin. So that layer, it has two layers. You don't have to worry about the individual names, but no, the blue, the colors here, both of them are the dura mater. Dura mater. Now, again, that's a tough layer that it is flexible. It comes in contact with bone from on top, but then beneath it there's another layer. There's a space beneath. So beneath the blue, the second blue here, there is a space called the subdural space, right here. Subdural space. You can see here. So here's the dura mater. Beneath it, there is a subdural space. Okay, and then beneath the subdural space, there's another layer, that gray kind of layer that has a lot of these webs. This is called the arachnoid mater, or the arachnoid membrane. So arachnoid, because when you look at it, you'll find that it has many extensions, blood vessels, and all kinds of tissue, and it is almost like a spider's web. So that area here, the arachnoid membrane or the arachnoid mater. Beneath it, it has a space that is called the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space. And that is very, very important. Many blood vessels run through the subarachnoid space. And also inside of the subarachnoid space, there is it is filled with fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid continues all around the brain and all around the spinal cord all the way. So it surrounds the entire brain and entire spinal cord, and it has very, very important functions. I wanted to just give you a couple of things so you can remember. When someone has an accident, you might hear about something called, or a stroke sometimes, subdural hematoma or subdural hemorrhage, for example, subdural hematomas. So what happens is, here is the dura, the second, the dura mater. Beneath it, between the dura mater and the arachnoid membrane, and that space, here, the blood might, if there's a rupturing or something, the blood might accumulate in that space. And then when it accumulates, it is going to, say if the blood vessel ruptures, it's going to, accumulate and create a pool. And that's going to push down on different parts of the brain here, and that's going to be expanding and expanding. Every time it expands, it's going to kill and push down neurons in different parts of the brain. If it is massive enough, it can actually kill the person. So that is, like I said, subdural. When there's subdural hematoma or subdural, hemorrhage or something, that is what we are speaking about. So the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Number one, they maintain a constant exterior environment around the brain and the spinal cord, around the neurons and the glia that we studied. So water is a regulator. It is what regulates our temperature in our body. For example, constantly, the water molecules are heated up. They take the heat of your, from metabolism, and they become hot. And then they get out of our body as sweat or as we breathe and so on. They exit our body. So when they exit, they take the heat with them. So you notice when you are running, you are going to sweat because your body is going to put, your water molecules will take in that heat, and then when they exit your body, then you decrease that heat. You release that heat through the water that you release. On a humid day, even though the temperature may be 70 degrees, but humid, you feel like it is so muggy and you feel warm and all of this, because humid means there's so much pressure on your body that the water molecules cannot exit. You cannot sweat. So the water molecules that are heated up, from your energy, they are trapped in your body and they can't exit. And as a result, you feel warm. And we do the same in the winter. How do you get warm? You cover yourself with a blanket. That means you trap the water molecules in your body. You prevent them from exiting. And this is how you feel warmer. So have surrounding the brain and the spinal cord with that space that has water in it, cerebrospinal fluid, that enables it to absorb the heat of the brain and the spinal cord, and to immediately kind of regulate and circulate take the heat out, and to regulate the temperature around the brain and the spinal cord. In addition, it serves all of this because it is surrounding the entire spinal cord and the brain. It is almost like you have them floating in water, you have them swimming in water, and as a result, you are cushioning them against, harm and movement and so on. And at the same time, you are also providing support and making them, for example, the brain is not gonna, when it is suspended in that fluid, it feels less heavy. You don't feel the weight of it. In addition, the cerebrospinal fluid, it serves as part of the immune system mechanism that enables the brain to dispose of its waste. And, as we spoke about the white blood cells that are modified for the brain and spinal cord, the microglial phagocytes, these again engulf debris and kill germs and bacteria and so on. And then you want to dispose of all of that waste. So the cerebrospinal fluid serves as like a river where you can dump, you can bring your waste into ships, and these ships will take away that and get rid of it. And then at the same time, you bring in certain molecules, for example, hormones, and other nutrients that are too big to go into the bloodstream. You bring them through the cerebrospinal fluid. One way, for example, for us to see if the brain has an infection, because the cerebrospinal fluid is continuous between the brain and the spinal cord, then if they get a spinal tap where they take fluid out of your spinal cord, they will know what is happening in your brain, and they will be able to diagnose meningitis, for example. So the cerebrospinal fluid, all of this, is connected with a system of ducts and ventricles, like spaces in the brain that are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid, and these kind of circulate, and the ventricles are connected with the cerebrospinal fluid system. And you need to know these ventricles. So the function of them is to basically to serve as part of the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid and the regulation of it. And these ventricles again are spaces, and there are 4 of them. So the first ventricle is called the right ventricle, or lateral ventricle, which is the right one. And then the other lateral ventricle means the other one on the other side is the left ventricle. So these are 2. And then you have the third ventricle beneath here. And then you have a little duct called the cerebral aqueduct that goes down, like a little tube that goes down, and then it connects with another ventricle lower, which is in the brainstem, that is called the 4th ventricle. So that is the system again that is responsible for the cerebrospinal fluid. And when you hear about a disorder called hydrocephalus, that is a system where these ventricles have more fluid than they should have, and that is going to push on the parts of the brain that are close, and that is going to cause inflammation and to cause pressure, and it causes disabilities. So again, 2 lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, the 4th ventricle, and then the cerebral aqueduct connects the 3rd ventricle with the 4th. Now let's look at the structures of the brain now. We looked at the spinal cord, we looked at the ventricles, and the cerebrospinal fluid, and we looked at the meningeal layers. Now we look at the brain tissue itself. Apologize for the sun just hitting on me, but again, the important thing is my voice, I guess. So we go again from below, and as we go up, finally at the very end, we go to the cerebral cortex at the very end. So we spoke about the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is continuous. As you could see, this area here is part of the spinal cord. And then there's a line here between the green and the pinkish color. That line is the border between your skull and your neck. And the hole that the spinal cord goes through here, the hole is called the foramen magnum, which is at the base of the skull. Means the big hole, basically, the foramen magnum, which again at the base of the skull. And I pointed it out last time. So even though the spinal cord is continuous with the brain stem, there is nothing there that says, okay, this is where this begins. No, it's just the part that is inside of the skull. We call it the brainstem, and the part that's beneath the skull, we call it the spinal cord. So, but they are continuous. So, beginning from that green part here, and it's the brainstem, we have one structure. We call it the medulla oblongata. Oblongata means long, so long. And then on top of it, there is another segment called the pons. Pons comes from the word bridge in Latin. And then there's that greenish part here on top, like cables, and the parts behind it here. This is called the midbrain. So the brain stem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Out, as you could see, out of the brainstem, along the brainstem from top to bottom, we have 12 cranial nerves, 12 on each side, so that you have, coming from the top, parts, for example, the superior colliculus, for example, you know where it is, that level. There is a nerve that has to do with eye movement, with vision, and we studied the auditory, the visual auditory reflex and how it works. So that is because this area is specialized in movement of the eyes and control of the eyes. And then as you keep going down, then the different nerves will branch out to the very end with the nerve that controls the tongue, hypoglossal nerve. And all of these are called the cranial nerves. Why do we call them the cranial nerves? The single reason is that the roots of these nerves, their origin, they originate on the brain stem inside of the cranium, inside of the skull. That's the only reason. But they exit and go to different parts of the face and, the neck and so on, and the trunk. But just know that the only reason we call them the cranial nerves is that they originate, the roots of them are inside of the cranium. So the brainstem basically generally is responsible for autonomic nervous system functions. And we are going to look at the general functions, and then we'll look at the functions of each part, the major functions of each part. So first, overall functions, you can see how the spinal cord is. It is basically, a connection between the upper parts of the brain and the lower parts of the brain, of the body. So all of this information is going down to the spinal cord, and the brainstem is a hub for bringing information up to the brain and bringing information down from the brain. Bringing information down means motor commands. Anything that has to do with movement then is going to go down through the brainstem. And also, it connects, the pons, for example, connects the cerebellum with the rest of the brain. So, it receives sensory information from different parts of the body. That information comes from the peripheral nervous system, from the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. And then it sends that up to the, to the brain. To the cerebral cortex. And then also it provides motor control for head musculature. And the reason is, for example, some of these cranial nerves are responsible for moving the muscles of the neck and the muscles of the shoulders. For example, I can shrug my shoulders because there is a nerve here, number 11, cranial nerve 11, that is here called the accessory nerve. That goes down and into my shoulders, and I can shrug my shoulders. So these nerves again emerge there, and then they connect with different parts of the head and the face, and they enable us, for example, to taste, to feel the skin of our face, to feel pain, to move different parts of our, facial structures and so on. And some of these nerves go down to the shoulders and inside of your trunk. So it also relays sensory information from the spinal cord to the brain and from the brain to the spinal cord. And it also regulates very important functions of arousal and awareness through a system called the reticular formation system. If you look at the reticular formation system, there's a structure here that looks like a worm. It begins on the top of the pons, and it goes down and down, down. Then you wouldn't see it because of the colors here. And then it continues to go down to the medulla. So it's like a worm. It's called reticulus because it has dark brown patches and light brown patches because it produces certain neurotransmitters. So the reticular system, it regulates your sleep-wake cycle, for example, and it also it makes you have that kind of wakefulness that you are awake. It means arousal means you are up, you are not sleeping, and awareness means that you are aware of what's going on around you. In order to have awareness, you need to have arousal, so that both of these two contribute to your consciousness. So that is these are major functions of the brainstem. Some of the nuclei means clusters of neurons. Usually neurons exist on the very top layers of the brain. So we call them, for example, they make tracks and we call them neurons and so on. But when the body of neurons, a cluster of bodies of neurons are together, bundled together, and they are deep in the brain, we call them nuclei. One is nucleus. And so some of the nuclei of the brainstem control motor output. For example, some of the neurons, like I said, the example I gave, nerve number 11, which is the accessory nerve, it's going to give me control over my shoulders, for example, and it will enable me to turn my neck left and right through the, control of neck muscles. So some of these neurons have motor functions, some have sensory functions, and some have both motor and sensory functions. And we will be studying them, especially the ones that have to do with speech. We're going to study them in class. Some of the nuclei, for example, are in the brainstem, control hearing, as the one that we studied, the auditory nerve here, and vestibulocochlear nerve. Basically, the auditory nerve is part of it. And then, so hearing and balance, cranial nerve 8, and then taste. And that is through the different parts of, there's more than one nerve that controls taste. And also the brainstem generally regulates and contributes heavily to swallowing. This is why if someone has a car accident that affects brainstem, their swallowing is also most likely affected. And you have centers that control breathing, breathing and heart rate, and hearing. So there's a cardiovascular center here. There is a respiratory center that regulates the respiratory cycle, one breath out, one breath in, and there's one that controls the sequence of the respiration itself. So these two here, both in the pons and the medulla oblongata, control breathing. And then, like I said, there's the reticular system here, and there's also the olivary system. So all of these, as you can recall, are autonomic nervous system functions primarily. And yes, the motor part, there is voluntary movement in terms of the motor component as well, which is here, motor output. We'll just touch upon a couple of functions, a few functions for each structure individually. So what we discussed is generally for the entire system, generally the brainstem, but we'll look at the functions here of individual components. The medulla oblongata, that lower part, as you could see, it has functions including digestion, swallowing, breathing, and heart rate regulation. So regulation of breathing, regulation of heart rate, and I pointed out the centers that, for example, enable you to regulate the cycles breathing, and also it contributes, for example, to swallowing and so on. The pons, called pons because pons means bridge. What does it bridge? So bridge is basically, it is bridging the cerebellum with the brain. It means it is connecting the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. So the pons, as you could see from the medulla continues up. The tissue ones and the pathways continue going up and down. And around that, there is a structure that wraps around. You could see it here. So this is the front. And the back, you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is like a brain. And instead of having a spinal cord, it has three big cables coming out that basically carry all, the axons of all parts of the cerebellum. And there's one cable that goes up to the head, to the upper parts of the brain, called the superior peduncle. And then there's one called the inferior peduncle. And then there is one here, the big one, called the middle. So that middle cerebellar peduncle. So again, superior goes to the higher levels of the brain, and inferior goes to the spinal cord. And then the middle goes out and kind of fans out and branches and comes around and makes this structure like this. So what you see in the front here is an extension basically of the middle cerebral peduncle, and it wraps around that piece of the brain stem. So the piece of the brain stem covered by that structure and the structure itself, all of this area, this segment, is called the pons. The pons. So the pons, the functions of it, it relays motor input, brings it from the cerebral cortex down to the cerebellum. And it also brings information also from the cerebellum into the rest of the brain. So the cerebellum is a major regulator of movement. It gives you fine motor control. It gives you, as you are moving, it gives you feedback. It catches your mistakes as you try to move, and to see if there are any errors in movement, motor movements. Then the cerebellum can detect them and can send them up to the cerebral cortex so that you can make corrections. So it is a very important part. And again, the pons is a major structure that connects the cerebellum to the brain stem and the rest of the brain. And it brings in information about motor movement from the brain to the cerebellum. The midbrain sits on top of the pons. And again, as you could see, it continues through to the spinal cord. But we just, for simplicity, we call it, give it a special name, and it gives rise to different cranial nerves. And for this reason, it has control over particular functions. But basically, the midbrain, it has pathways coming down and pathways going up. And it has the colliculi, the inferior colliculus that we studied last time, and the superior colliculus, so we know what they both do. So that midbrain coordinates many sensory and motor functions. And we have seen how it regulates the auditory functions through the inferior colliculus, and how it regulates the auditory visual reflex through the superior colliculus. So it also controls eye movement and coordination here of the visual and auditory reflex that we studied in reference to sound localization. The cerebellum is almost like a brain on its own. It's small, 1/6 of the brain, size of the brain. And it has a right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And it has a cerebral cortex, it has gray matter, white matter, and so on. The only difference is between it and the cerebral cortex of the brain is that the cerebellum has three cortical layers, 3 layers on the very top, like the covering of it, as here, that grayish, that little margin here that is convoluted. This is the cerebral cortex, the cerebellar cortex, the covering, the covering of the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is packed with neurons. It is more dense. The neurons are packed more densely in it than in the brain and the cerebral cortex itself. It has about 70 billion neurons. So the here all of these fibers, white matter fibers, all from one hemisphere, come together, and they're cabled, made into cables, into these three big cables: the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the middle, and the superior. So the inferior rises through the midbrain and to the rest of the upper part of the brain, and then the inferior goes into the spinal cord, and then the middle is going to go around, and together it's going to make a big part of the pons. So basically most of the pons is made out of the middle cerebellar peduncle. So the major functions of the cerebellum are modifying the force of movement. Like, for example, you want to reach, to get a glass. If you need to just make the movement slow enough so that by the time you reach the glass, you don't push it away. So it modifies the movement. If you want to hit a ball, for example, or something, how much of energy will you put? What angle? And so on. So it modifies the force and the range of movement. And it is critical in sports. Very, very important in accuracy in sports. And it contributes to motor learning. And again, this is a function in addition here that is not spelled out. It serves as part of fine motor regulation because it edits motor commands. It has a copy of the intended movement, and then it also has a copy of the movement that is actually happening, for example, is being performed, and that compares both of them together. And it says, well, you plan to do this, but it's not coming out as it should. So these are the errors. And then it gives you that feedback so you can correct your errors as you are performing the movement. It also contributes to language functions, and it contributes to cognitive functions, thinking and all of these functions. Interestingly, the cerebellum is connected with the cerebral cortex in a very intricate way, but the right hemisphere of the cerebellum is connected with the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, and the left hemisphere of the cerebellum is connected with the right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. So it has many, many functions, but these are just very basic ones. Maybe it's a good time now to give yourself a little break, 5 minutes break, and then come back so that you can kind of refresh your mental energy. The diencephalon sits on top of the brainstem. So again, here is the brainstem and the midbrain, and that structure here that sits on top of the midbrain, that is called the diencephalon. And again, here's one, and there's another part beneath it. It's not really showing well here. And as you could see, there's left and right of each structure. So here again, diencephalon, here's basically the thalamus, and there's another structure called the hypothalamus. It's not visible here. So thalamus and the hypothalamus make up the diencephalon. So if you look here, this is, the thalamus is here, and then beneath it, there's another structure like a lower chamber called the hypothalamus, that area that has this nuclei. So the nuclei are basically the structure of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected with a gland, a special gland, that is called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is basically a storage site for the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. So let's look broadly. The thalamus, because of its location, so this is here, it is two pieces, left and right. Here's one structure, and inside it has 10 compartments, 10 centers. And some of them control, contribute to movements, some contribute to hearing, and so on. And just about every sense is connected with the thalamus as well. So the lateral there's the medial geniculate body here, medial geniculate body. We studied it, and it contributes to hearing. It is a major auditory processing center. And we said that it has a name. Sometimes we call it the auditory thalamus. And it can amplify signals when these signals are compromised. It can amplify more than 50 times. So it plays a major role in processing information before that information reaches the cerebral cortex. Here's the cerebral cortex, that convoluted, all of these convoluted structures, part of the cerebral cortex. And also from the central nervous system, basically the spinal cord and all different parts. For example, all the information goes to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord and so on. And from there, it is going to go to the thalamus. So one is called thalamus, and two, left and right, we call them the thalamic nuclei. The thalamic nuclei. Also, the thalamus serves as a gating mechanism for sensory input, sensory stimuli. So you have, for example, information coming in, and from your hands or your legs or the rest of your body, and then it goes in, and then it reaches the thalamus. Let's say hearing, for example. And let's say that the signal is not really good. It is distorted, or you are in noise, and then the signal is not really good. So that part of the thalamus will gate sensory stimuli. It will make it optimal. It will make the signal better so that you can hear it better. Or if the signal is really, really loud and bad, can damage your hearing, the medial geniculate will contribute by not amplifying and by, for example, contributing to tuning down that signal so that it can protect you. So gating, if someone doesn't have appropriate functions of, in the thalamus, they would have difficulty, for example, regulating their attention, regulating their hyperactivity, when there's so much, too much stimulation in the environment, these people cannot calm themselves down and so on. The hypothalamus, which are basically these structures, it lies beneath the thalamus. And again, it has the pituitary gland as a storage site. So the hypothalamus produces many hormones, and these hormones serve as regulators of different functions of the body. For example, they are used to control endocrine, for example, functions like secretions of different, fluids in the body, different chemicals in the body. For example, the fear response, when you are faced with a threat, immediately you start to feel hot and your palms will be sweaty, and your saliva dries out, and you feel like you are like in that adrenaline rush and you are ready to fight. The reason is that the hypothalamus it releases the hormones into the bloodstream. It has control over your kidney functions, and the cortices on top of the kidneys, there are glands that make adrenaline and other chemicals, and that's gonna make you burn more energy and so on, raise your blood pressure and all of this. So the hypothalamus primarily plays regulatory functions. It plays a major role in the control of autonomic body functions. For example, your saliva, amount of saliva produced, the amount of, tears that your eyes make, or the fluid made by your eyes. So it can lubricate that. Blood pressure regulation, how much, for example, how much water you have in your blood, your thirst. When should you be thirsty? When the blood becomes more acidic, then that hypothalamus is going to trigger control. It will control the amount of urine going out so that you can preserve your fluids. And then it will trigger your thirst so that you can go have water, and the water goes into the bloodstream and it will make it less acidic and so on. It also controls sexual functions, sexual reproduction, and, many other functions that are autonomic. The cerebral cortex. So, as I explained, think about the structure again, just to rewind a bit. We have the spinal cord and the kind of the lower structure, and then on top of it you have the brainstem, and on top of the brainstem you have the diencephalon, and on one side then you have the cerebellum. All of these structures, everything in addition to that, everything else that comes on top of that is the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum makes basically 77% of the total brain weight. It is the whole structure that wraps around the entire, basically when people look at it, they say this is the brain. And it has numerous connections, and it has, the gray matter, the white matter, and a lot of structures embedded underneath. So here again you have the spinal, the brain stem, and then back at the cerebellum, and then you could see the thalamus inside, and everything else. All of these structures here, all of these convolutions and all of this, these are parts of the cerebrum. I hope you do not confuse the cerebrum with the cerebral cortex. Many students make that big mistake. So when I say name the parts of the cerebrum, they actually give me the cerebral cortex. No, the cerebral cortex is only one part of the cerebrum. Okay? So do not make that mistake. Here is the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is made, it basically has two big parts, the right hemisphere and then the left hemisphere. The two hemispheres are connected with a structure called the corpus callosum. So whatever happens, the structure is in the right side, right hemisphere, they are almost like mirror images of each other, like your right hand, left hand. So the parts of the cerebrum, again, the cerebrum is all of this. That's, you exclude out of the whole brain, you exclude the cerebellum, you exclude the brain stem and the diencephalon. Everything else is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum consists of these parts. Number one, the cortex, which is the outside cover, the very top layer of the cerebrum is called the cortex. Cortex is basically, the word means tree bark. When you have an onion and you cut it, it has layers. These layers are called a cortex is a layer. So every layer of the onion is called a cortex. So it's an outside cover. And it is mostly, so the cerebral cortex is the very first part. If you cut through, then go down, you will find white matter. So the cerebral cortex, basically, it has the gray matter. And I'll tell you why. And then beneath it, you have the white matter. And then there are structures that you could see here. That are clusters of neurons, and they serve particular functions. These are called the basal ganglia. Ganglion is a cluster of bodies of neurons. So basal, and because most of the bodies of the neurons they reside on the cerebral cortex. Anything else that goes down, that lives down there, deeper in the brain, as clusters of bodies of neurons, we call them nuclei. Sometimes we call them ganglia. One is ganglion, one cluster. So these are the basal ganglia, 5 structures, and then the hippocampus, and then the amygdala. So how many structures does the cerebrum include? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 major structures. So here again, we're going to look again at the cortex at the cerebrum in a different kind of view. This is, this is a coronal cut. Nice. Coronal cut, front, back. You can see this is one hemisphere. All of this is one hemisphere of the cerebrum, and then the other hemisphere. And you can see in the middle, if you cut these like that, you have left and right. These structures that are shown here are the basal ganglia. When they are cut, then you would see parts of them here. These are the basal ganglia. And here. And here's the thalamus. Here's the thalamus. Sorry for that, annoying, thing that pops up. And then you have the corpus callosum that that connects left and right hemispheres. Corpus callosum. So here's the corpus callosum. Basically, you want to take all the extensions of, all the axons of all the neurons, and then you want to connect them with the other side. So you put this into like compact cables, and then you connect them with the other side. So that is basically white matter. These are all axons that are condensed into major cables, so that the right hemisphere shares information with the left, and the left shares information with the right. And so the corpus callosum is the largest pathway that connects the 2 different parts of the brain. Commissure means pathway, big pathway. It is made out of white matter axons. Again, when you bundle all the input from one hemisphere, bring it all together and connect it with the input from the other hemisphere, then you have the corpus callosum. It's the superhighway of information. that goes from left to right and right to left. And it is critical for the integration of information in the brain. The integration of motor information, sensory information, emotional information, cognitive, linguistic, all you cannot have normal functioning if you do not have that corpus callosum, intact. There is a disorder, for example, that's called agenesis of the corpus callosum. If it's not well developed, that's going to cause a very significant neurological and cognitive disorder here. So, again, the corpus callosum is the major connection, the structure that connects the right hemisphere of the cerebrum with the left hemisphere. So now, all of this white matter is part of the cerebrum, and the very, very top layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. And we'll study it more in detail, but we'll look now at the corpus callosum and then other structures before we study the cerebral cortex. The basal ganglia, again, are 5 major structures. They're here. And they are clusters of bodies of neurons that are buried deep in the brain, and they are around the thalamic nuclei, around the thalamus. And they include the putamen, the globus pallidus. It's a structure that lies next to this one here. It is not showing well, but it's a structure that lies next to this one, globus pallidus. And the caudate nucleus. Basically, this is the putamen, and then you go up, the caudate is the tail here. And then the substantia nigra, they're little structures that can show you here. Substantia nigra, little structures that have to do with movement, and they are not far from the thalamus. And then we have the subthalamic nuclei. Also, you go here, you will find subthalamic nuclei, these green dots here. So subthalamic means beneath the thalamic nuclei, and then beneath you have the substantia nigra, or the black substance. That is because it has dopamine in it, and dopamine is dark gray when it is in that tissue here. And this is also the caudate nucleus. It's also part of these structures here. So globus pallidus is 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the main functions of the basal ganglia, they are critical for connecting the cerebral, the top part of the cerebral cortex, white matter, gray matter, with the lower parts of the brain. So they have motor regulation functions, regulate your movement. They regulate your mood and your emotional states. If you are angry, if you are happy, if you are, and so on. They contribute to regulating language and communication, especially social pragmatic skills. So, what's appropriate, what is not. So these are 3 major functions, and each one has a pathway that it uses 3 major connections with the frontal lobe of the brain, and these connections are used to control motor regulation, mood and emotional states, and also language and social communication skills. So, the hippocampus is one part of the cerebrum. The hippocampus is this structure here that is deep, very deep, behind the temporal cortex. And it is your memory processing center, your major memory processing center. It does not store information permanently. What it does is, you can think of it either as an airport. For example, flights come into that airport, people are processed, they go through gate 1, gate 2, gate 3, gate 4, and then they go to whatever, other flights, or they exit the airport. And then so for people coming into the airport, people leaving the airport, and that is just the information as it comes from your senses. That information goes to the hippocampus, and it will be sorted out, will be processed, will be prepared, so that it can be sent to the storage sites. All the storage sites are basically in the cerebral cortex, the very, very top layer of the brain. So all of the very top layer of the brain is where information is stored and it is processed. But the memory center, the hippocampus, sorts it out so that visual information, for example, is stored in the visual cortex. Motor information is stored in the frontal cortex. Categories of animals, this, that, everything that you have has a particular area where it is stored. And in order to store the information, it has to go through the hippocampus. If you do not have that, right and left, the person will not be able to form new memories. So also the hippocampus is needed to retrieve information from the storage sites, from the different parts of the cortex. You can think of it also as, one of these gigantic hotels. Like, say there's a hotel that has, 100,000 rooms. And there's a switchboard at the reception. And anyone wanting to reach a room, you come in as a customer, say, okay, I'd like to reach room number 10. And the switchboard says, okay, here you go. Room number, and so on. Someone from room number 10 wants to reach the reception. So that serves as the switchboard, if you will. In order for you to process information, take it in and store it, you have to go through the hippocampus. In order for you to retrieve information and bring it down from the storage site, you have to start with the hippocampus as well. So the hippocampus does not store information permanently. It does not. Information stays approximately for an hour there, and then it gets sorted out and then sent to be consolidated and so on. The amygdala is a little structure that is like the size of a pea, and it is located next to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is here. The amygdala is located next to the hippocampus, and the amygdala is connected with the basal ganglia. So the amygdala is your primary emotional processing center, especially emotions that have to do with social experiences and fear regulation. So it has a major, for example, the fight or flight response. It is regulated also by the amygdala. People who have phobias, you are afraid of spiders, or you're afraid of elevators, or whatever, they have a hyperactive amygdala. So the amygdala also has the ability to activate the hippocampus. Whenever you activate the amygdala, you are going to make information more memorable. You are going to make the information stored with a special, tag, so that the emotional value increases and the information becomes more memorable, because the amygdala, whenever it is active, it will activate the hippocampus, and the hippocampus will take in the information and store it, so it will become hard to forget. So that is also, there are two pathways between the amygdala and the frontal cortex of the brain, the prefrontal cortex here. That is where your judgment and decision making and so on is. So one pathway that originates in the amygdala, it gives you information about your emotions here. And then one pathway that originates in the prefrontal cortex, it controls your emotions. So that pathway that controls your emotions matures about 14 to 15 years of age. And this is when people start to reason, to think about their emotions, and you can give and take with them. They are not impulsive, and they can control their emotions. But before that, they go into tantrums and all of this. I want to attract your attention here to the structure of the hippocampus here. That is a lateral view of it. And also this gyrus that extends on top of the hippocampus, the corpus callosum. A structure that covers the corpus callosum, that is called the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus. And that's another part, that is part of the cerebral cortex. But we'll discuss it later. But I just wanted to attract your attention to this when it is here. So now, I'm just going to mention a couple of things about lateralization of the cerebral and the cerebral hemispheres. I'm going to go back to an image here. So here's one hemisphere, for example. Lateralization means that one side has certain functions that are known, and the other side has certain functions. However, these functions are not separated. For one hemisphere to function appropriately, it has to be connected with the other hemisphere so that the information can be complemented. You do not want to have, two sides of the brain that do the same thing. That will be a waste of energy. So why not have one side being dominant for certain things and the other side being dominant for the other things, and then combine their input and get more work done? So to say that there is someone who's a right hemisphere person or someone who's a left hemisphere person, these are myths. They do not exist anymore. There is no such thing as a right hemisphere person and the left hemisphere person. Both of them work together and complement each other. So the other thing is, the right hemisphere of the brain controls the motor functions of the left side of the body. So if someone has a stroke in the right hemisphere and that affects motor functions, that person's left side will be impaired. It could be paralyzed, it could be weaker. If someone has a left brain, say stroke, the right side of the body is going to be affected, whether paralysis or weakness or whatever it is. So that is in terms of, motor functions and sensation as well. So again, right hemisphere controls left side of the body and left hemisphere controls right side of the body. In terms of cognitive functions and language functions and so on, the main functions of the left hemisphere is processing sounds, phonemes, processing syntax. There's an area here called Broca's area that is only described in the left hemisphere only. When you say Broca's area, it only exists in the left hemisphere. The functions, And word semantics, the functions of words, the meanings of words, left hemisphere. Speech recognition and comprehension of speech is in the left hemisphere. Analytical skills, also in left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is dominant for it. And then processing intentions of speech, like I say hi to you. Why am I saying hi to you? If I just go like this, what does that mean? So all this, you know, the intentions of someone winks at you. So you know the intentions, and that is basically left hemisphere, and especially left and front of the left hemisphere. And also, so lying, for example, how do you know someone is lying? Left hemisphere and front of the left hemisphere, because it has analytical skills. You can say 1 + 1 is this and that. If he did this or she did that, then this is going to happen. Right hemisphere is more dominant for global things, like the overall picture of things. So, for example, I'm telling you a story. Then you hear the words, you process them, you assemble them, you understand their meaning in the left hemisphere. And then, if there is something in the word that is not direct, that is implied, like reading between the lines, the right hemisphere says, oh, this is what the meaning is. And then when you put all the different parts and the sentences that make the story together, then you have a whole one complete story that is called discourse. And that is the right hemisphere that looks at the whole image. Oh, this is the story, what the story is about. And it enables you to understand the whole thing together. The right hemisphere also is dominant for facial processing of facial emotions, facial expressions. Are you expressing surprise? Are you expressing disgust? Are you expressing pleasure? This, that, all of this is processed by the right hemisphere. Your tone of voice. Are you angry? Are you sarcastic? Are you mad? All right hemisphere. Understanding the speaker's intent, the implied intention, for example. What you are trying to insinuate, in other words. Understanding theory of mind, being able to read someone else's brain, to know what she thinks, for example. What is she thinking about? What does she know? You know, and so on. When you understand theory of mind, you can predict what the person feels when you say something. Will you offend them? Will you, say something that makes them happy? And so on. Inferences. Anything that is implied, that is not directly stated, the right hemisphere is dominant. But the right hemisphere wouldn't know unless it gets the words and the sentence structures from the left hemisphere. So you know that both of them work together. When you speak, how are you able to make a story where you put a beginning and then you go into details in sequence gradually? This is happening, and after this happens, and someone does something, and as a result, this happens, and this and that. How do you sequence a story or when you speak, make your verbal output organized and coherent and making sense? That is because of the right hemisphere. So you all see that it has to do with the global aspects of things, with making you see the whole picture of things, and understanding the implied statements, things that are not mentioned in words. For example, when you say, it is raining cats and dogs, immediately the left hemisphere will say, oh, cats and dogs, raining, and it will look, you're gonna look up to see if cats and dogs are landing, coming down like, snow, falling from the sky. But the right hemisphere says no. And then you suppress the literal interpretation, and then you give rise to, no, that means that it is raining heavily. So again, it is dominant for, processing implied and inferential statements and things that are not directly stated, and also the tone of voice and the facial expressions in terms of the emotional value of them. Is the person angry? Are they sarcastic? What are they trying to tell us through their tone of voice and the facial expressions? So this is the part again. Now, when we come to class, we are going to continue and we'll focus more on the cerebral cortex, and then we'll study the cranial nerves, and that will end the unit. But I'm going to give you some questions now at this point, before you put this recording off. Try to answer these questions on your own. If you do not, then go back and listen again to the different parts. So this is like your study guide that I'm giving you here. And the reason I have it to the end is so that you can kind of go back. So first part, what are the two major anatomic branches of the nervous system? What are the two functional or physiological branches? What are the different parts of each? For example, the physiological, the autonomic and the somatic. What are the different parts of each? What are the major parts of the spinal cord? What are the three main parts of the brainstem? The three major components. So you need to know every part of these and the structure of these, where exactly it is located, and also you need to know the main functions of each part. What is the peripheral nervous system made of? In other words, what does it include? What are the functions of the spinal cord? What are the three layers of the meninges, or the meningeal layers? What are they? What are the names of the spaces beneath the space beneath the dura mater? What do you call it? What do you call the space beneath the arachnoid mater? What is the cerebrospinal fluid? Where is it produced? What are its functions? What about the ventricles of the brain? How many are there? What are they? Name them. What are the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid? I just said that. So what are the names, again, of the ventricles, and what is the name of the disorder that is characterized by increased fluid inside of the ventricles? What about the cerebellum? Can you describe it? Where is it located? Basically, it's located in the posterior, inferior. It is located on the posteriorly and inferiorly to the brain, to the cerebral cortex, I mean. So on top of it is the part of the cerebral cortex, and it lies in the posterior to and inferior to the cerebral cortex. What is the diencephalon? What are the parts of the diencephalon? What are the functions of each part? Now, in terms of the cerebrum, what are the 5 major structures of the cerebrum? What is the name of the structure that connects the cerebral hemispheres? What are the functions of that structure? What are the basal ganglia? How many are they? What are the 3 major functions of the basal ganglia? Why do we call them the basal ganglia? Basically, the ganglion is a cluster of bodies of neurons that is located beneath, deep in the brain. And ganglia means more than one ganglion. And basal is basically because they have to do with the root. They are deeply buried beneath the white matter. What are the functions of the amygdala, and where is it exactly located? In the temporal cortex, just in case, in the behind the temporal cortex, next to the hippocampus. What are the major functions of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere? What are the functions of the reticular formation? So these are highlights that if you are not able to answer any of these questions at this point, you need to go back and study listen again and take notes again about the parts that you needed to refresh. And that's it for this section. And it will be followed by the segment on the cerebral cortex and also the cranial nerves. Thank you.